Why did I take my niece's stepdad to court then celebrate when I lost? 14 months ago, my sister died in my arms. Her nurse walked in holding a piece of paper within minutes. This is your sister's only dying request. I opened the tear-stained letter with shaking hands and my jaw dropped. My husband has been grooming my daughter. It started when he thought my cancer made me too weak to notice. I thought I could handle it alone. But he destroyed the cameras and corrupted the audio recordings. My face went pale as I read this last part. I need you to make sure that bastard pays. Kill him if you have to. You know my address. I went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. I always told my sister I would do anything for her. That doesn't change because she's dead. I immediately drove to her house where my 10-year-old niece was sitting on the porch, her backpack already packed. Her stepfather stood blocking the doorway, his arms crossed. She's not going anywhere. I'm her legal guardian. My niece stood frozen behind him, 10 pounds lighter than when I'd last seen her. The door slammed shut. Through the window, I watched him lead her upstairs, his hand gripping her wrist. I filed for emergency custody the next morning, but his lawyer was already prepared. My client is concerned about the uncle's mental stability following his sister's death, he argued. She's been stalking the family. The judge granted me supervised visits only, 2 hours monthly at a community center. My first visit wasn't for 3 weeks. When I finally saw her, she'd lost more weight. Dark circles made her look hollow. I don't sleep good, she whispered while we played checkers. He checks on me a lot at night. The supervisor wrote something down. My niece immediately went quiet. That's when my lawyer started building our case. I hired a private investigator to gather intel. I learned about his ex-wife who fled to a different country with their young daughter, learned about his involvement in the corn industry, and slowly the tables were turning. 3 weeks later, the stepfather confronted me at a grocery store. I know what you're doing, he said calmly. Stop following me or you'll never see her again. My investigator approached me that night, 12 weeks before the trial. He threatened my family, he explained. I'm sorry, but I can't do this. He took all the files he'd gathered with him. My niece's teacher called me secretly a week later. She fell asleep in class and had a nightmare. She was screaming, please don't, I'll be good. I brought this information to my lawyer, but the stepfather had already gotten to the school. The teacher visited us and officially recanted everything with 10 weeks to trial. My niece was pulled from that school the next day, enrolled somewhere that wouldn't tell me. During my next visit, everything was different. Everything is fine at home, she said robotically. He takes good care of me. She'd been coached. When the supervisor stepped away briefly, she quickly lifted her sleeve, bruises shaped like fingers. The supervisor returned before I could photograph them. I started driving by their house at night 8 weeks before trial. I'd parked down the street and watched as her bedroom light stayed on until dawn. Sometimes I'd see him enter her room at 2, 3 in the morning. I called police for welfare checks, but he'd charm them every time. Concerned uncle making trouble, they'd write in their reports. Child appears well cared for. 2 months in, she'd stopped eating almost entirely. During a visit, she gave me a drawing when the supervisor was distracted. It showed a stick figure girl getting smaller and smaller until she disappeared completely. That's me, she whispered. I tried submitting it as evidence, but his lawyer called it childhood imagination. With 6 weeks to go, we had nothing. That's when I made the drastic choice and broke into their house while they were at a doctor's appointment. I found her diary under loose floorboards. The entries progressed from I miss mommy to he comes in my room to I want to disappear. The last entry was just help, written over and over. I photographed everything but couldn't use it without admitting to breaking in. During what would be my last visit before trial, she hugged me and whispered quickly. He said after the trial, we're moving far away where you can't find us. Her body was shaking. He has tickets already. Says no one will stop him once he wins. I knew then the system would fail her completely. And so, I spent the next few months planning to get justice my own way. You see, court security was extremely loose in my home country back then, and I took full advantage of that. By the time court date arrived, I was ready. I knew the trial would be a formality. His lawyer destroyed every piece of evidence and discredited every concern. I was called obsessed and delusional with grief. My niece sat in the gallery 20 pounds underweight now, staring at nothing. When asked if she wanted to live with me, she said in a monotone voice, I want to stay with my dad. Everyone could see she was coached except the judge. When the judge finally ruled insufficient evidence and gave full custody to the stepfather, I simply stood up. Thank you, Your Honor. With that, I pulled out my small snub-nosed revolver and fired 3 shots directly into the stepfather's chest. He started bleeding out as security tackled me, and when I was put in handcuffs, I knew this was far from over. Bailiffs hit me from 3 directions at once, their weight crushing me against the floor while my ears still rang from the gunshots. The courtroom erupted into screaming and people running for the exits. Through the forest of legs and shoes, I saw another bailiff grab my niece by the shoulders and rush her toward the side door, her mouth open in a scream I couldn't hear over the ringing. The stepfather lay maybe 10 feet away, blood spreading across his white shirt in dark circles that kept growing. Someone was shouting for a medic. Someone else was yelling at people to clear the room. my face pressed against cold tile that smelled like floor cleaner. A knee dug into my back between my shoulder blades. Hands yanked my arms behind me and metal cuffs bit into my wrists. The hollow calm I'd felt when I pulled the trigger was still there, like I was watching all this happen to someone else. A bailiff pulled me up to my knees, and I saw the stepfather's lawyer kneeling next to him, pressing something against the chest wounds. The judge had disappeared from the bench. My niece was gone through the side door. People in suits were crouched behind benches like they thought I had more bullets. I didn't. The revolver lay on the floor where I'd dropped it after the third shot. They hauled me to my feet and shoved me toward a door behind the judge's bench. My legs worked but felt disconnected from my body. A bailiff who looked maybe 25 kept one hand on my shoulder, not rough but firm, guiding me through a narrow hallway with beige walls. We passed paramedics running the other direction with a stretcher and medical bags. One of them had blood on his hands already. The young bailiff said something about child welfare being called for my niece, his voice quiet like he was trying to be kind. I wanted to tell him she needed protection from everyone who'd failed her up until now. I wanted to explain that the system had just given her back to a predator, but my mouth wouldn't form words. My tongue felt thick and my throat was closed up tight. We went through another door and down some stairs. The bailiff kept his hand on my shoulder the whole time. His radio crackled with voices talking about securing the scene and getting witness statements. Someone said the shooter was in custody. That was me. I was the shooter now. The holding cell smelled like a mix of strong cleaner and old sweat that had soaked into the concrete. They sat me on a metal bench bolted to the wall. A female officer with gray hair pulled back tight started going through my pockets. She took my wallet, my keys, my phone. She put everything in a clear plastic bag and wrote my name on it with a black marker. Another officer picked up the empty revolver from where someone had brought it down and sealed it in an evidence bag. The female officer told me to stand up and take off my belt. I did. She took my shoelaces too, pulling them out of my sneakers one hole at a time. She had me sit back down and started reading from a card in a flat voice that said, I had the right to remain silent. I nodded at each question she asked. Did I understand these rights? Yes. Did I want to waive these rights and talk to them? Number. She wrote something on her clipboard. The whole time I kept seeing my niece's face as they rushed her out of the courtroom, the terror in her eyes. I'd meant to save her, but I'd just given her a new nightmare to add to all the others. Detective Van McDermott showed up maybe an hour later. He looked tired, like he'd been working all day before this happened. Coffee stains marked the front of his wrinkled dress shirt. He pulled up a metal chair and sat down across from me, setting a notebook on his knee. He introduced himself and said he was investigating what happened in the courtroom. His tone was professional but not mean. He asked if I wanted to talk about what happened and why I did it. I looked at him directly and said I wanted a lawyer. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. He closed his notebook and stood up, tucking his pen into his shirt pocket. Before he left, he told me they'd be processing me soon and moving me to county jail. His eyes weren't angry or disgusted, just tired. Like he'd seen too much of people doing terrible things for reasons that made sense to them, but not to anyone else. The door clanged shut behind him. I sat on the metal bench and stared at the gray wall across from me. My hands were shaking now, even though they'd been steady when I pulled the trigger. Around midnight, a different officer came to the cell, a younger guy with a thick neck. He stood outside the bars and told me the stepfather was in surgery at County General with critical condition from the chest wounds. My stomach twisted up with this sick mix of relief that he might die and fear about what would happen to me if he did. The officer watched my face carefully while he gave me the news. He was probably looking for remorse or guilt or something that showed I understood what I'd done. I didn't feel those things yet. I felt empty and cold, and like my body was still separate from my brain. The officer wrote something on a clipboard and walked away. I lay down on the bench even though it was too narrow and uncomfortable. The fluorescent light stayed on all night. I didn't sleep. I kept seeing the moment over and over. Standing up when the judge ruled against me, saying thank you to her. Pulling out the gun. The stepfather's face when he realized what was happening. The sound of the shots. My niece screaming. It played on repeat behind my eyes every time I closed them. Morning came with another officer bringing me to a small room with a video screen. A judge appeared on the screen. An older woman with glasses and a serious expression. She explained in a clear voice that I wasn't getting bail because I'd shot someone in a courtroom. A public defender stood next to the screen taking notes on a yellow pad. He had thinning brown hair and a cheap suit. He told me this was expected given the circumstances. The judge said I was looking at murder charges if the stepfather died, attempted murder if he survived, plus weapons charges for bringing a gun into court. The whole thing took maybe 10 minutes. The judge asked if I understood the charges. I said yes. She set a date for my next appearance and the screen went black. The public defender said someone from his office would be in touch soon. He gathered his papers and left. An officer took me back to the holding cell. My arraignment was over. My life as I knew it was over too. Back in holding, a guard came and brought me to a different small room. A man in his early 30s sat at a metal table with a worn briefcase open in front of him. He had serious dark eyes and introduced himself as Nathaniel Elliott, my assigned public defender. He got right to business. laying out file folders on the table between us. He said he wasn't going to sugarcoat anything because I needed to understand the reality. I was facing decades in prison. Our only hope was building context for sentencing, not avoiding conviction. There was no path where I walked away from this. The best we could do was try to reduce how long I'd be locked up. He asked me to tell him everything, starting with my sister's death and the letter she left. His pen moved across his notepad as I talked. He didn't interrupt or judge. When I finished, he closed his notebook and looked at me with those serious eyes. He said we had a lot of work to do and not much time to do it, but he'd fight for me as hard as he could within the limits of what the law allowed. Nathaniel opened another file and told me a woman named Geraldine Ward from CPS had already been assigned my niece's case. She was arranging emergency placement because my niece couldn't stay at the house where the abuse happened, and I obviously wasn't an option anymore since I was in jail for murder. He explained they'd do something called a forensic interview with her soon, where trained people would ask her questions about what happened at home. If she disclosed abuse, it could provide some context for why I snapped, though it wouldn't make the shooting legal. Nothing would make it legal. I'd still killed someone. But context might help at sentencing. Might mean the difference between 15 years and life. He asked if I had any family who could take her in. I mentioned my sister's cousin Kira, who lived a couple hours away. Nathaniel wrote down her name and said he'd pass that information to Geraldine. My niece needed stability and safety now. That was the priority, not me, not my case. Her. On day 2, Nathaniel came back with news. The nurse who'd given me my sister's letter had contacted the police. She was willing to testify about the chain of custody. She'd kept a copy of the letter and documented the exact time she handed it to me. This proved I had reason to believe abuse was happening. It wasn't much, but it was something real. It established that my sister tried to warn someone with her dying breath. Nathaniel said this testimony would be crucial for building our context argument. It showed I didn't just snap randomly. I had credible information from my dying sister that her daughter was harmed. The prosecution would argue I should have gone through proper channels. We'd argue I tried and the system failed. Neither argument would get me out of prison, but one might reduce how long I stayed there. Nathaniel left me copies of the nurse's statement to review. I read my sister's words again in the nurse's careful handwriting. Her fear, her desperation, her plea for me to protect her daughter. I'd done what she asked. Now I'd pay the price. On day 3, an officer came to my cell in the afternoon. He stood outside the bars and watched my face carefully. He said the stepfather had died from his injuries without ever waking up. My chest got tight with this weird combination of relief and horror hitting me at the same time. Relief that he couldn't hurt my niece anymore. Horror that I'd actually killed someone. That I'd taken a life. The officer kept watching me, probably writing a report later about how I reacted to the news. I didn't cry or celebrate. I just nodded and said okay. He left. I sat on the bench and stared at my hands. These hands had ended a person's life. Within an hour, Nathaniel called the jail, and they brought me to a phone room. He confirmed the stepfather was dead, and the charges were being upgraded to second-degree murder. My sentencing range just jumped from maybe 8 to 12 years to 15 years to life. The stakes had changed completely. This wasn't attempted murder anymore. This was actual murder. I'd killed him. He was dead because of me. Nathaniel's voice on the phone was calm and steady. He said we'd deal with this. We'd build the strongest possible case for sentencing. But I needed to prepare myself for a long time in prison. A very long time. I hung up the phone, and an officer took me back to my cell where I'd spend the next however many months waiting for trial. Within days, the news broke everywhere. Local stations ran stories with my mugshot next to courthouse footage. The headlines called me vigilante uncle and courtroom killer, depending on which outlet you looked at. Online comment sections split between people saying I did what needed doing, and others calling me a murderer who scared a kid even worse. Someone posted the whole custody case timeline on social media, and suddenly everyone had opinions about what I should have done differently. Nathaniel showed up on day 5 with a folder full of printed articles and told me to stop asking guards about news coverage. He said public opinion meant nothing in court, only evidence and law mattered. I wanted to know if people understood why I did it, but he cut me off and reminded me that jury selection would handle public perception later. What mattered now was building our case with facts. The media circus would die down eventually, and we needed to focus on legal strategy, not headlines. I nodded but kept thinking about my niece seeing those articles someday, and what she'd think of me. The next morning, a court officer delivered papers through my cell slot. The judge issued protective orders preventing any contact between me and my niece, not even letters or phone calls allowed. Nathaniel explained this during our next meeting, saying it was standard procedure when someone commits violence in a child's presence regardless of motive. The court viewed me as potentially dangerous to her now, even though I'd been trying to protect her. He also mentioned the prosecutor was considering a gag order to prevent me from talking to media, though he said I should stay silent anyway since anything I said could hurt our case. I asked if the protective order was permanent, and he said it would stay in place at least through trial, and possibly longer depending on sentencing. The reality hit that I might never talk to her again, never explain why I did what I did, never hear her voice. I'd killed someone to save her, and now I was legally barred from ever being near her. Nathaniel pulled out his notes from our previous meetings and started reviewing everything I'd told him about gathering evidence before the shooting. His face got tight and serious when I described breaking into their house to find the diary. He set down his pen and explained that anything I found during that illegal entry couldn't be used in court and might even get me additional charges for burglary. I'd sabotaged my own case by acting like I was above the law, even though I was trying to save her. The diary photos I took were inadmissible, and mentioning them to police could lead to more criminal charges. He asked if I told anyone else about the break-in, and I said no, just him. He nodded and said we'd never mention it again, pretend it never happened, because bringing it up would only hurt me legally. All that risk I took finding her diary, and it couldn't help her at all now. Meanwhile, Geraldine moved my niece out of that house the same day the stepfather died. She went to an emergency shelter for abused children, while CPS identified appropriate placement options. Nathaniel got word through official channels that they were scheduling a forensic interview, where trained specialists would ask her about what happened at home. These interviews used specific techniques to help kids disclose abuse without leading questions or pressure. I was desperate to know what she'd say, whether she'd finally tell someone the truth now that he couldn't threaten her anymore. But Nathaniel explained I wouldn't hear details because of the protective order and the ongoing investigation into my case. The interview results would go to CPS and possibly the prosecutor, but I was cut off from that information. All I could do was hope she felt safe enough to talk and that someone would finally listen to her properly. Detective Van started building a case around the abuse allegations using the nurse's letter as his starting point. He tracked down the teacher who'd originally called me about my niece's nightmare and got her to provide another statement now that the stepfather was dead and couldn't retaliate. Van applied for search warrants to examine the house, digital devices, and financial records for evidence of grooming behavior. Nathaniel said Van seemed genuinely invested in uncovering the truth rather than just closing my case quickly. Most detectives would focus only on the shooting itself, but Van was digging into why it happened. He was treating the abuse allegations seriously instead of dismissing them as my delusion. This gave me the first real hope that someone in the system might actually prove what that man did to her. The judge held a hearing on Van's warrant application and granted a limited search for evidence related to the planned relocation and materials suggesting ongoing abuse. It wasn't as broad as Van wanted, but it allowed his team to examine computers, phones, and documents related to travel plans. Nathaniel reminded me this investigation was separate from my criminal case, and even if they proved abuse happened, I still committed murder. The best outcome would be context for sentencing, not avoiding conviction. I understood but still felt relief that someone was finally investigating properly. Van's team executed the search warrant 2 days later and found printed tickets showing the stepfather and my niece were scheduled to fly to another state 3 days after the custody hearing. There was also a lease agreement for an apartment in that state starting the following week. First and last month's rent already paid. Nathaniel called this consciousness of guilt, explaining that the stepfather was planning to run with her before anyone could investigate properly. The plane tickets and lease proved he knew people were getting suspicious and wanted to disappear with her where I couldn't find them. This evidence supported everything my niece had whispered to me during that last visit about moving far away. It showed I'd been right to worry he'd take her somewhere beyond reach. Van tracked down the ex-wife who'd fled to Canada years ago with their daughter. She'd been hard to locate because she'd changed her name and moved provinces multiple times. When Van finally reached her and explained what happened, she agreed to provide a sworn statement via video conference. She described similar patterns of control and inappropriate behavior that made her fear for her daughter's safety years ago. Her testimony established he'd done this before with another child, showing a pattern of predatory behavior across multiple victims. Nathaniel warned this might not be admissible in my trial since it was prior bad acts, but it strengthened the overall picture of who this man really was. The ex-wife's statement proved I wasn't crazy or grief-deluded when I believed my sister's letter. Nathaniel scheduled a long meeting in a private room at the jail, where we could talk without other inmates overhearing. He sat across from me and laid out our defense strategy in plain terms. We weren't trying to prove I was innocent because I clearly shot the man in a crowded courtroom. Our goal was providing context that might reduce my sentence by showing extreme emotional disturbance based on reasonable belief my niece was in danger. He needed me to accept that I was going to prison, and we were just fighting over how long. The best possible outcome was maybe 8 to 12 years instead of 15 to life. I'd be an old man when I got out either way. He asked if I understood, and I said yes, though part of me still wanted to believe a jury would let me walk free. He shook his head and said that wasn't realistic. I needed to prepare myself for a long sentence and focus on making it as short as possible. 3 weeks after the shooting, Geraldine identified Kira Logan as a potential kinship placement for my niece. Kira was my sister's cousin, someone we'd seen at family gatherings over the years, but not frequently. She and her husband Darren had 2 kids of their own and lived 2 hours away in a smaller town. They agreed to take my niece in temporarily, while CPS completed a home study and background checks to make sure the placement was appropriate. Nathaniel got this information through his contacts with CPS and told me it was good news that she'd be with family instead of strangers. Kira knew my sister and understood the family history, which would help my niece feel less alone. I wanted to thank them somehow, but the protective order prevented any contact, so I just had to trust they'd take care of her properly. Van got his hands on medical records from Dr. Mallory Witt, the pediatrician who saw my niece twice in the months before my sister died. Nathaniel brought copies to our next meeting and spread them across the metal table between us. The records showed my niece had lost 8 pounds over 3 months, dropping from the 50th percentile to below the 20th. Dr. Witt's notes mentioned sleep problems and recommended counseling that the stepfather never followed up on. The doctor had written, "Caregiver appears dismissive of concerns," in the margin of the second visit. Nathaniel tapped the page and said, "This proved multiple professionals noticed something wrong, but nobody connected the dots." The system saw the red flags and did nothing. Laurent Bates, the forensic tech going through the stepfather's devices, found something that made my chest tight when Nathaniel told me about it. Cloud storage receipts showed purchases of small cameras and audio recording equipment from 6 months before my sister's diagnosis. Then newer receipts appeared showing replacement purchases after the original equipment was listed as returned. The dates matched up almost exactly with when my sister wrote in her letter about destroyed cameras. Laurent told Van the shopping pattern suggested the stepfather knew someone was watching him and took steps to cover his tracks. He'd bought the gear, got caught, destroyed it, then bought new equipment to keep monitoring for anyone else trying to gather evidence. The teacher who originally reported my niece's nightmare reached out to Van directly through an email to the detective's office address. She said she wanted to give a formal statement reversing her earlier recantation. Van met her at a coffee shop with her union representative sitting right there the whole time. She explained how the stepfather's lawyer had called the school administration and threatened legal action for defamation. The principal pulled her into his office and strongly suggested she walk back her concerns if she wanted to keep her job. Van recorded her new statement on his phone with her permission, creating an official record of what she actually witnessed. She described my niece screaming in her sleep during class, the specific words about being good, and how the child had looked terrified when she woke up. Another inmate in my cell block started trouble 3 weeks into my stay. He was in for assault, a big guy with tattoos covering his arms who'd heard through the jail gossip what I was locked up for. He cornered me during rec time near the basketball court and got in my face. He called me a child killer who scared a little girl and said people like me didn't deserve to breathe. My hands balled into fists and every muscle in my body wanted to swing. But I thought about Nathaniel's warnings and forced myself to turn around and walk away. The guy shoved my back, but I kept walking toward the guard station. 2 officers separated us and wrote up the incident. Nathaniel came by the next day and told me staying calm was exactly the right call. I needed to show I could control myself now, even if I couldn't in that courtroom. Any fight would get used against me at sentencing to prove I was violent and dangerous. Nathaniel spent our next meeting warning me about the jail phone system. He leaned forward and spoke quietly, even though we were alone in the attorney room. Every single call I made was recorded, and prosecutors would listen to all of them looking for anything useful. He told me to assume someone was always listening, and to avoid discussing any details about the abuse or my actions. I couldn't talk about my niece or what I believed happened to her. I felt trapped by the silence, wanting to tell someone, anyone, about what that monster did to her. But Nathaniel was firm that protecting her now meant keeping my mouth shut completely. Anything I said could hurt the case or worse, hurt her by dragging her through more legal proceedings. Adelia Stokes showed up at my cell door on a Thursday morning with a clipboard and a kind smile. She introduced herself as a therapist who worked with the jail and said she'd be meeting with me weekly to document my mental state. We sat in a small office with barred windows while she asked questions about my sister's death. She wanted to know how I processed losing her while worrying about my niece at the same time. Her voice stayed warm and professional as I described watching my sister die and reading that letter. During our second session the following week, she asked me to walk through the actual shooting. I started talking, and then everything went blank and distant like I was watching it happen to someone else from far away. Adelia made a note and said I was dissociating when discussing the trauma of what I'd done. The family court judge issued an order that Nathaniel called a small victory. The order officially vacated the stepfather's custody rights after his death based on the ongoing abuse investigation. It was mostly paperwork since the guy was already dead, but it opened up guardianship proceedings where the court would decide my niece's permanent placement. Nathaniel explained this removed legal barriers that might have complicated Kira and Darren becoming her official guardians. Van's team knocked on doors in the neighborhood around the stepfather's house and found a neighbor with a Ring doorbell camera. The footage showed the stepfather entering and leaving at odd hours over several months. Van counted multiple instances of him going upstairs around 2 or 3 in the morning. The timestamps matched exactly with what I'd observed during my nighttime surveillance from down the street. The neighbor told Van he never thought anything was wrong because he assumed the stepfather was just checking on a sick child. Laurent finished his deep analysis of the stepfather's laptop and found search history that made me want to throw up when Nathaniel read it to me. Queries about managing difficult children and preventing false allegations. Searches for international relocation requirements with dependents. Multiple deleted browser sessions that forensic recovery suggested included research on detecting hidden cameras. Nathaniel said this painted a clear picture of someone who knew his behavior was wrong and actively worked to avoid getting caught. The guy had been planning and calculating every move. Nathaniel filed a motion with the court asking to reserve all the abuse evidence for my sentencing hearing rather than trying to introduce it during trial. His argument was that the evidence wasn't relevant to whether I committed the act since I obviously did, but it was crucial for understanding why I snapped. The prosecutor objected immediately, wanting to keep the focus purely on my actions rather than the stepfather's behavior. The judge said she'd take the motion under advisement and rule after reviewing all the evidence both sides submitted. 3 days after Nathaniel filed the motion, someone leaked the plane ticket information to a local news blogger. By that afternoon, my case was all over social media with people arguing about whether I was a hero or a killer. The blogger posted screenshots of the e-tickets showing the stepfather planned to fly out with my niece just 3 days after winning custody. Comments exploded with people saying the system failed her, and others saying I traumatized a child by shooting someone in front of her. Nathaniel called me that evening and told me Geraldine had to move my niece to a different location because reporters were staking out Kira and Darren's house. One news van followed Kira's car to the grocery store trying to get footage of my niece. Geraldine arranged for a police escort to take my niece to the school and back until the media attention died down. Nathaniel sounded tired when he explained that whoever leaked the information violated confidentiality rules, but he admitted it was shifting public opinion slightly in my favor. People were asking why the stepfather needed plane tickets if everything was fine at home. The leak created problems, but it also made people pay attention to the abuse evidence instead of just focusing on the shooting. I asked Nathaniel if the publicity would help my case, and he said judges don't care about public opinion, but it might make the prosecutor more willing to negotiate. 2 days after the leak went viral, Zachary Wu called Nathaniel and asked for a meeting. Nathaniel drove to the prosecutor's office and sat across from Wu for an hour discussing my case. When Nathaniel came to see me at the jail that afternoon, he had papers in his briefcase and a serious look on his face. He explained that Wu was offering a plea deal for voluntary manslaughter with an agreed sentence on the high end of the range. The offer meant I'd plead guilty to a lesser charge than second-degree murder, and we'd agree to a specific sentence instead of letting the judge decide. Nathaniel laid out the terms carefully, making sure I understood what voluntary manslaughter meant versus the murder charge I was facing. Wu was offering this because the abuse evidence was making his case more complicated, but he wasn't willing to go any lower because I still killed someone in a courtroom. Nathaniel told me we needed to seriously consider the offer because going to trial was a huge risk. I felt my chest tighten as he explained the sentencing range and what it would mean for how long I'd be locked up. The deal would give me some certainty instead of gambling on a jury trial where I could get life in prison. I rejected the plea offer the second Nathaniel finished explaining it. My hands were shaking as I told him there was no way I was accepting a deal when I was trying to save her from a predator. I stood up and paced the small interview room, my voice getting louder as I explained that the stepfather was planning to take her away and abuse her for years with no one to stop him. Nathaniel sat quietly and let me vent for 20 minutes while I went through everything I'd tried to do through proper channels. I reminded him about the custody case I lost, the investigator who quit, the teacher who recanted, all the times the system ignored the warning signs. I told him a jury would understand why I did it once they heard about the plane tickets and the abuse evidence Van was uncovering. Nathaniel waited until I ran out of steam and sat back down, then he leaned forward with his elbows on the table. He explained calmly that my moral certainty about doing the right thing doesn't change legal reality. I shot someone in a courtroom in front of dozens of witnesses, including my niece. No matter how justified I felt, no matter what the stepfather did, I committed a serious crime, and I wasn't walking away from this. A trial could result in life in prison if the jury decided I acted with premeditation instead of extreme emotional disturbance. Nathaniel's voice stayed even as he told me that believing I was right doesn't mean a jury will agree, especially when I brought a gun into a courthouse and executed someone. I told him I needed time to think about the offer, still clinging to the belief that 12 people would see the truth once they heard everything. Nathaniel closed his briefcase and said he'd give me a week to decide, but I needed to understand what I was risking. 3 days later, Adelia came for our regular therapy session. She sat across from me in the small room they used for counseling and pulled a folder from her bag. Her face was gentle but serious as she explained she had something to show me from my niece's forensic interview. The interview had happened 2 weeks ago with a trained specialist who knew how to talk to traumatized children. Adelia opened the folder and pulled out a photocopy of a drawing. The image was done in crayon with a child's unsteady hand. It showed a door with a lock drawn on the outside and a small stick figure inside the room. The figure had tears coming down its face. Adelia explained that the therapist who did the interview filed a mandated report based on this drawing and other things my niece disclosed during their conversation. I stared at the photocopy, seeing my sister's daughter's fear translated into simple crayon marks on paper. The lock was on the outside of the door. She'd drawn herself trapped inside. Something broke in my chest as I looked at that small figure with tears, understanding that this was how she saw herself during those months. Adelia watched my face carefully and made notes about my reaction. I couldn't stop staring at the drawing, thinking about how she'd picked up those crayons and tried to show someone what was happening to her. The therapist had understood what the drawing meant. They'd filed the report. The system was finally listening, but only after I'd already shot the stepfather. I folded my hands on the table to stop them from shaking. That same week, Van executed a second search warrant specifically targeting the hidden compartment that Fletcher Gonzalez had mentioned. Van's team went back to the stepfather's house with tools to carefully open the floorboards in my niece's room. They photographed everything before touching it, documenting the exact location and condition of the compartment. Inside, they found packaging and parts from camera equipment, but no intact devices or storage cards. There were empty boxes that had held small cameras, instruction manuals, and USB cables. Laurent took everything back to the lab and analyzed the serial numbers on the packaging. He determined the equipment had been purchased over a period of 8 months, with the most recent purchases happening right after my sister died. Laurent's report concluded that the stepfather likely destroyed the actual recording devices after my sister confronted him about the cameras. The packaging proved he'd bought the equipment, but there was no way to recover what he'd recorded since the devices themselves were gone. Van called Nathaniel and explained that this evidence was frustrating because it built the pattern of predatory behavior without giving them actual proof of what the stepfather had done. Nathaniel told me the packaging and parts were still valuable because they corroborated my sister's letter about destroyed cameras. It showed the stepfather had the means to record my niece and that he'd taken steps to eliminate evidence when he got caught. The pattern was becoming clearer, even without the smoking gun we'd hoped to find. The following week, CPS filed a petition to posthumously terminate the stepfather's parental rights based on substantiated abuse findings from their investigation. Nathaniel explained this was mostly a legal formality since the stepfather was already dead, but it created an official record that the state found credible evidence of harm. The petition went through family court, where a judge reviewed all the evidence Van and Geraldine had gathered. The judge signed an order finding that the stepfather had abused my niece and that his parental rights would have been terminated if he were still alive. This order went into the official court record and the state database. Nathaniel brought me a copy of the order, and his face was more relaxed than I'd seen in weeks. He explained this record would be crucial during my sentencing because it validated my belief that my niece was in real danger. The court was officially acknowledging that the abuse happened and that the stepfather posed a threat to her safety. It wasn't enough to make my actions legal, but it proved I wasn't acting on paranoid delusions or grief-driven fantasies. The state itself was saying my sister's warning letter was accurate. Around the same time, Nathaniel scheduled an interview with the nurse who'd given me my sister's letter. He drove to the hospital where she still worked and sat down with her in a conference room. The nurse pulled out a file she'd kept with detailed notes about my sister's concerns in the weeks before her death. She documented conversations where my sister talked about suspecting her husband was hurting their daughter. The nurse had written down specific dates and times when my sister mentioned trying to gather evidence. During the interview, the nurse also mentioned that my sister had talked about a diary where her daughter wrote about what was happening at home. Nathaniel's face went pale when he heard this. He came to see me that afternoon and asked directly if I knew anything about a diary. I admitted I'd found it during my break-in and photographed the pages. Nathaniel closed his eyes and took a deep breath before explaining that this was exactly the kind of illegally obtained evidence that could backfire on us. The diary existed and corroborated everything else, but because I'd broken into the house to find it, we couldn't use it in court. Worse, if the prosecutor found out about the break-in, he could file additional charges against me. Nathaniel told me we had to hope the diary stayed hidden and that we could build our case without it. 2 days after that conversation, Fletcher Gonzalez contacted Van directly. Fletcher had been watching news coverage of my case and recognized the address of the house where he'd done work 2 years ago. He called the detective's office and explained that he'd installed a custom floorboard compartment in my niece's room at the stepfather's request. Fletcher remembered the job clearly because the stepfather had been very specific about wanting a hidden space that looked completely normal from above. Fletcher had thought it was for storing valuables or important documents. He'd built the compartment with a pressure release opening that you couldn't see unless you knew exactly where to press. Fletcher's testimony gave Van a legal pathway to search that specific location without relying on my illegal entry. Van took Fletcher's statement and had him sign an affidavit describing the work he'd done. The contractor's independent knowledge of the compartment meant Van could get a warrant based on legitimate information instead of anything I'd discovered during my break-in. Van took Fletcher's affidavit to a judge and got a warrant for the floorboard compartment based on the contractor's statement. Van's team went back to the house a third time and used Fletcher's instructions to open the hidden space. Inside, they found fiber evidence and imprints in the wood suggesting something had been stored there recently, but the space was now empty. Laurent examined the fibers under a microscope and found they matched materials commonly used in journal or notebook bindings. He measured the imprints in the wood and determined the patterns matched a journal-sized object that had been stored there for an extended period. It wasn't the diary itself, but it proved something matching a diary's size, and shape had been hidden in that exact spot and recently removed. Laurent's report supported my account of finding a diary there without the prosecution being able to prove I'd broken in to get it. Van called Nathaniel and explained that the evidence showed the stepfather had hidden something in a secret compartment in his stepdaughter's room, which was suspicious behavior that fit the pattern of someone concealing abuse. The day after Van found the fiber evidence, Zachary Wu called Nathaniel again. This time Wu's tone was harder and less friendly than before. He told Nathaniel he was giving me one more chance to take a plea deal before he threw everything possible at me. Wu threatened to add a firearm enhancement to my charges that would add years to my sentence if I went to trial. The enhancement applied because I'd brought a gun into a courthouse, which was a separate crime on top of the killing itself. Wu said he was done negotiating, and if I didn't accept a deal in the next week, he'd make sure I got the maximum sentence possible. Nathaniel met with me that afternoon and explained that this was standard prosecutor pressure tactics. Wu was feeling the heat from the abuse evidence, but he was also genuinely prepared to make an example of me if I forced him to trial. Nathaniel's voice was serious as he told me the threat about the firearm enhancement was real. Judges really don't like courtroom violence because it undermines the entire justice system. If I went to trial and lost, the judge could easily give me the maximum sentence to send a message that you can't take the law into your own hands, no matter what your reasons are. I sat in that interview room staring at the concrete wall, finally understanding that my belief in doing the right thing might cost me the rest of my life in prison. Nathaniel reviewed my jail call logs the following week and told me the records showed I'd followed his instructions perfectly. Every conversation I'd had was about basic things like how I was doing or what books I was reading, nothing about the case or my niece. The guards submitted reports saying I'd avoided all fights even when other inmates tried to start something, and I'd followed every rule without complaint. Nathaniel explained this documented behavior would help at sentencing because it proved I could control myself when I wasn't in crisis mode. The prosecution would try to paint me as dangerous and unstable, but these logs showed I was capable of following rules and making good choices. I sat across from him in the interview room and felt weird pride in something so basic as not getting into trouble. Meanwhile, Geraldine submitted her monthly report to the court about my niece's placement with Kira and Darren. The report noted she'd gained 3 pounds since moving in with them, which was good progress. But she was still underweight for her age. She had nightmares most nights and resisted bedtime, often staying awake until she was too tired to fight sleep anymore. The school counselor at her new school was providing weekly sessions, and my niece was slowly starting to talk about feeling scared at her old house. She wouldn't give details yet, but she'd said the stepfather made her feel bad, and she didn't like being alone with him. Geraldine wrote that progress was measured in small data points rather than big breakthroughs, and the placement was stable, even though my niece still had a long way to go. I read the report copy Nathaniel brought me, and felt relief mixed with guilt that she was healing while I sat in jail. Adelia met with my niece's therapist to develop a treatment plan that would address her specific trauma. They decided on something called cognitive behavioral therapy that would help her understand her thoughts and feelings weren't her fault. The plan included a safety protocol for when she felt triggered by memories or situations that reminded her of the abuse. The court also ordered the stepfather's house sold with all proceeds going into a trust fund for my niece's therapy and future needs. The money wouldn't fix what happened to her, but at least she'd have resources for college or whatever she needed later. Adelia told me during our next session that structure and routine were helping my niece feel less chaotic, even though she was still deeply wounded. Kids need to know what's coming next, and that the adults around them will keep them safe, and Kira and Darren were providing that stability. I asked if my niece ever mentioned me, and Adelia said she couldn't share details from the other therapist's sessions, which I understood but still hurt. Van worked with the Canadian authorities to verify Judith Chandler's background and the statements she'd made about the stepfather. The court received her sworn affidavit a few weeks later, and it included references to a report she'd filed with Canadian police years ago about his behavior toward their daughter. Judith wrote that he'd been inappropriate with their child in ways that made her uncomfortable, including entering the bathroom when their daughter was bathing and insisting on helping her dress even when she was old enough to do it herself. She'd reported these concerns to authorities, but nothing came of it because he denied everything, and their daughter was too scared to talk. Van contacted the Canadian Police Department directly and confirmed the report existed in their system, though no charges were ever filed. This pattern of behavior across multiple children in different countries was damning evidence that the stepfather had been grooming kids for years. Nathaniel said this affidavit strengthened our sentencing argument because it showed I'd acted on reasonable belief based on a documented pattern, not paranoid delusions. Zachary Wu called Nathaniel about 2 weeks after the Canadian affidavit was authenticated. Wu said he was willing to drop the firearm enhancement from my charges if I agreed to plead guilty and give up my right to appeal. He explained he was feeling pressure from the abuse evidence that kept piling up, and he wanted this case resolved without it turning into a media circus at trial. Nathaniel told me Wu was probably worried about losing public support if all the abuse details came out during a trial, and a plea deal would let him close the case quietly. Wu made it clear this was probably the best offer I'd get, and I needed to seriously think about whether fighting this was worth the risk of dying in prison. Nathaniel sat with me for over an hour going through the math of what a trial could mean versus accepting the plea. If I went to trial and lost, the judge could give me the maximum sentence just to make an example out of me for bringing violence into a courtroom. But if I took the plea, I'd have a defined sentence range and wouldn't risk spending the rest of my life locked up. Before I could even consider Wu's offer, Nathaniel said he wanted to negotiate one condition. He told Wu he needed informal promises that CPS would keep monitoring my niece's placement and therapy, no matter what happened with my case. Nathaniel argued that my whole reason for doing what I did was to protect her, so any resolution should include making sure she stayed protected. Zachary agreed to write a letter supporting continued CPS services, though he explained he couldn't make official promises about what CPS decided to do. It wasn't much, but it showed the prosecutor admitted my niece needed ongoing protection from the system. Nathaniel brought me a copy of Wu's letter, and I read it 3 times, looking for anything that felt like they were finally taking her safety seriously. The abuse investigation officially closed the following month with a finding of substantiated abuse. This meant CPS had reviewed all the evidence and determined there was credible proof the stepfather had harmed my niece. The finding got entered into the state database and became part of the permanent record that would follow any future background checks or investigations. Nathaniel explained this substantiation was as close to winning as I was going to get, because the system was officially admitting it had failed her. No criminal charges would ever be filed against the stepfather since he was dead, but the record would show he'd abused a child in his care. I felt strange satisfaction knowing that even though I'd go to prison, everyone would know I'd been right about what was happening to her. The family court held a hearing about my niece's placement and granted temporary guardianship to Kira and Darren. Geraldine would continue as the supervising caseworker, checking in regularly to make sure everything stayed stable. My niece would stay with them while permanent guardianship got finalized over the next few months through more court proceedings and home studies. Kira sent word through Nathaniel that my niece was safe and adjusting to her new school, making friends and sleeping better than before. This was the first real relief I'd felt since the shooting, knowing she had people who would protect her the right way. Nathaniel and I spent hours over several visits drafting my allocution statement for the plea hearing. This was the part where I'd have to stand in front of the judge and admit what I did while explaining why I did it. We worked on language that acknowledged I shot the stepfather while I was under extreme emotional problems after getting real information my niece was abused. The statement needed to be honest without sounding like I was making excuses, accepting responsibility while giving context for my actions. We went through probably 15 different versions before we found words that felt right. Zachary, Wu, and Nathaniel finally worked out the complete plea agreement after another week of back-and-forth negotiations. I'd plead guilty to first-degree manslaughter with extreme emotional problems, which carried a sentencing range of 8 to 20 years. It wasn't the voluntary manslaughter charge I'd hoped for, but it was way better than the second-degree murder charge that could have meant life in prison. Nathaniel explained this was actually a fair outcome, considering I'd killed someone inside a courtroom in front of dozens of witnesses. The judge would make the final sentencing decision within that range, but at least I knew the worst-case and best-case scenarios now. Nathaniel came back 2 days later with papers for me to sign. He sat across from me in the interview room and put his briefcase on the metal table. "I need you to understand what a trial means for your niece," he said quietly. "She'd have to take the stand and answer questions about what he did to her. Zachary would cross-examine her about the details. Defense would try to poke holes in her story. She'd have to relive everything in front of a courtroom full of strangers while you sit there watching." I felt my stomach turn over thinking about putting her through that. She was just starting to eat again, just starting to sleep without waking up screaming. Nathaniel slid the plea agreement across the table. "This protects her from that. You take responsibility, she doesn't have to testify, and she can keep healing without being dragged back into the worst parts." I picked up the pen and signed my name on every line he marked. The decision felt clear once I understood what saying no would cost her. The plea hearing happened on a Thursday morning 3 weeks later. Guards brought me into the courtroom in handcuffs and an orange jumpsuit. The judge sat behind her big wooden desk looking tired. Nathaniel stood next to me while the court reporter typed everything into her machine. Zachary stood on the other side looking professional in his suit. The judge asked if I understood I was giving up my right to trial by pleading guilty. "Yes, Your Honor," I said clearly. She asked if anyone had forced me or threatened me to take this plea. "No, Your Honor." She asked if I understood I was pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter. "Yes, Your Honor." Then she asked me to explain what I did in my own words. I took a breath and said I brought a gun into the courthouse and shot my niece's stepfather 3 times in the chest, causing his death. My voice stayed steady while I said it. The judge asked if that was accurate, and Zachary said yes. The facts were not in dispute. She accepted my plea and set a date for sentencing. Before we left the courtroom, Nathaniel made a motion asking the judge to excuse my niece from having to appear at sentencing. He explained she was 10 years old and in therapy, and making her come to court would be harmful to her recovery. Zachary didn't object to the motion. The judge agreed immediately and said my niece would not be required to attend or provide any statement. She scheduled the sentencing hearing for 4 weeks out to give both sides time to prepare their arguments. I felt grateful for this small protection, knowing she wouldn't have to see me in chains or hear people talk about what I did. She needed to move forward without being pulled back into the courtroom where I'd shot someone right in front of her. Nathaniel squeezed my shoulder briefly before the guards took me back to holding. 4 weeks later, they brought me back for sentencing. The courtroom was more crowded this time with people I didn't know sitting in the gallery. Detective Van took the witness stand first, wearing his detective badge clipped to his belt. Zachary asked him about the investigation into the abuse allegations. Van explained that CPS had substantiated the abuse after conducting interviews and reviewing evidence. He described the plane tickets they found, the ex-wife's statement from Canada, the medical records showing weight loss and sleep problems. He talked about the camera equipment receipts and the neighbor's doorbell footage. "I want to be clear," Van said, looking at the judge. "I'm providing context, not justifying the defendant's actions, but the evidence supports that he had reasonable belief his niece was in danger." Zachary asked a few more questions, and then Nathaniel declined to cross-examine. Van's testimony lasted maybe 20 minutes, but it laid out everything we'd found. Then the nurse took the stand. She looked older than I remembered, with gray hair pulled back. Zachary asked her about my sister's final hours. The nurse described how my sister had been struggling to breathe, how she'd kept asking for me. "She pressed this letter into my hands and asked me to give it to her brother the moment he arrived," the nurse said. She pulled out a copy of the letter from a folder. Zachary asked her to read the relevant portions aloud. The nurse's voice shook slightly as she read my sister's words about the grooming, about the destroyed cameras, about needing me to make sure he paid. I watched the judge's face get tight as she listened. When the nurse read the part where my sister said to kill him if I had to, the courtroom went completely quiet. The nurse finished reading and folded the letter carefully. "She died about an hour after writing this," she said softly. Nathaniel had no questions for her either. The judge took a break to review the pre-sentencing report. When she came back, she asked if I wanted to say anything before she imposed sentence. Nathaniel and I had talked about this and decided I should stay quiet. "No, Your Honor," I said. The judge nodded and started talking. She said she'd reviewed all the evidence about the abuse and found it credible and disturbing. She acknowledged I'd acted based on reasonable belief my niece was in real danger. But she said I'd taken the law into my own hands instead of trusting the system. She said I'd created additional trauma for my niece by shooting someone in front of her in a courtroom. She sentenced me to 14 years in state prison with parole eligibility after serving 85% of the sentence. She also ordered that I couldn't contact my niece directly unless she initiated contact as an adult and completed therapy processing. I stood there and took it without reacting. 14 years meant I'd be almost 50 when I got out, but it could have been life. Prison intake happened 2 days later at the state facility about an hour away. They processed me through a series of stations like an assembly line. Strip search in a cold room with fluorescent lights, medical screening where a nurse checked my blood pressure and asked about mental health history, dental exam that found 3 cavities. They took my fingerprints again even though they already had them. They issued me prison clothes, bedding, and a clear plastic bag for my few approved items. A classification officer interviewed me about my crime and decided I'd go to general population rather than protective custody. They assigned me to C Block, cell 247, with a cellmate named Rodriguez, who'd been there for 6 years on drug charges. The daily routine started immediately with count at 6 in the morning, breakfast at 7, then recreation or programs or work assignments depending on the day. I signed up for anger management and a victim impact course because Nathaniel said it would help at parole hearings. The first week felt endless, learning the unwritten rules about where to sit in the cafeteria and how to avoid trouble. 4 months into my sentence, a guard called me to the counselor's office. Geraldine had worked with Adelia to set up a letter exchange program where my niece could write to me if she chose to. The therapist would read any letters first to make sure they were appropriate. I could write back, but my letters would also be screened. The first letter arrived that same week in a manila envelope marked with the prison mail stamp. Inside was a piece of white paper with a drawing done in colored pencils. She'd drawn a house with a red door and yellow windows. There was a sun in the corner and flowers in the front yard. At the bottom, she'd signed just her name in careful letters. No message, just the drawing and her signature. I sat on my bunk and stared at it for probably an hour. I wrote back on prison stationery, keeping it short. I told her I was sorry for scaring her and that I hoped she felt safe now. I said I was glad she had a nice house to live in. I didn't mention myself or ask questions, just focused on her. Nathaniel sent me copies of the family court order 6 months after my sentencing. The judge had finalized permanent guardianship to Kira and Darren after completing all the required home studies and background checks. My niece was legally their ward now with therapy mandated through age 18. The order included provisions for regular monitoring by CPS and requirements that they maintain her in counseling. Kira and Darren had full legal authority to make decisions about school, medical care, and everything else. I read through the legal language and felt something settle in my chest. She had stability now, people who would protect her the right way, people who wouldn't shoot someone in front of her. The order meant she belonged somewhere safe, and no one could take that away from her. Geraldine's 6-month update came through Nathaniel a week later. She'd written a detailed report about my niece's progress. The medical records showed she'd gained back the weight she'd lost, now at a healthy number for her age and height. The nightmares had decreased from every night to maybe twice a week. She still had PTSD symptoms that got worse during transitions like school breaks or when routines changed. But she was attending school regularly without the absences that used to worry her teachers. She'd made 2 close friends in her new town, girls from her class who came over for playdates. The therapist noted she was starting to talk about feeling scared at her old house, which was progress even though it was painful. Geraldine's assessment said the progress was slow but real, exactly what you'd expect from a kid healing from long-term trauma. I folded the report and put it with the drawing she'd sent me, the only 2 things I cared about keeping in this place. The next morning, an inmate named Jairus who worked in the library asked if I wanted him to print out articles about my case from the internet. I told him no thanks. He looked confused because he'd been bringing me printouts every week since I arrived, showing me comment sections where people argued about whether I was right or wrong. I used to read every single one looking for validation or understanding or something. But sitting there with that drawing and Geraldine's report, I realized none of those strangers mattered. My niece was safe and gaining weight and sleeping better, and that was the only thing that counted. Jairus shrugged and walked away, and I never asked about the internet again. 3 weeks later, a guard handed me an envelope from Nathaniel with a memo inside. Detective Van had written up recommendations for the county training department about recognizing grooming behaviors. The memo laid out all the ways the system missed signs with my niece. Teachers needed better training on how abusers coach kids to stay quiet. Court personnel needed to understand why victims can't always speak up, even when asked directly. Social workers needed education about institutional barriers that prevent disclosure. Van listed specific examples from my niece's case, how multiple people saw problems but nobody connected the dots. At the bottom of the memo, he'd noted that these changes might help future kids avoid what my sister's daughter went through. Nathaniel had added a sticky note saying Van sent this to show something good might come from the tragedy. I read it twice and then filed it with the drawing and Geraldine's report. Nathaniel visited me one last time to close out my file. A guard brought me to the visitation room where he had paperwork spread across the table. He walked me through the prison system, explaining how good behavior credits worked and what programs I should complete. He said parole eligibility would come after I served 85% of my sentence, which meant about 12 years if I stayed out of trouble. He recommended anger management classes and the victim impact course because parole boards looked at that stuff. I took notes on everything he said, writing it down in careful letters. When we finished with the logistics, he packed up his briefcase and stood to leave. He paused at the door and turned back. "You made an impossible choice in an impossible situation," he said quietly. "The law had to punish you, but I understand why you did it." Then he walked out, and I never saw him again. 7 months after my sentencing, a guard brought me another envelope during mail call. I recognized the return address as Kira and Darren's house. Inside was a second letter from my niece, this one different from the first. She'd drawn 2 stick figures with labels underneath. One said me and the other said uncle, and there was a heart drawn between them. Below the drawing, she'd written a short message that her therapist must have helped with. It said she was feeling safer now and that she thought about me sometimes. The letter stayed general and didn't mention any details about what happened, just talked about feeling better. I read it 3 times and felt something tight in my chest loosen just a little. She didn't hate me. That was more than I deserved, but I'd take it. I folded the letter carefully and put it under my pillow where I could reach for it when the guilt got too heavy at night. Nathaniel sent another update 2 weeks later about CPS reducing their monitoring schedule. Instead of monthly visits to Kira and Darren's house, they were switching to quarterly check-ins. Geraldine had written in her final report that the placement showed strong stability, and my niece's overall functioning had improved significantly. The reduction in oversight meant the system trusted Kira and Darren to keep her safe without constant supervision. Backup plans stayed in place if she needed extra support, but the quarterly schedule showed confidence in the placement. I felt relief reading this, knowing she had people who were doing it right, and the system was finally backing off instead of interfering. On the 1-year anniversary of the shooting, I sat on my bunk with my journal and wrote a long letter to my sister. I told her about the cost of keeping the promise I made. I described my niece's progress, the weight she'd gained back, and how her nightmares were less frequent. I wrote about the 14 years I'd spend locked up and how I'd be an old man when I got out. I explained the complicated truth that I stopped the harm, but created new trauma in the process. She saw me shoot someone. That violence would be part of her memory forever, mixed in with everything else. I wrote that I saved her from ongoing abuse but scarred her with what she witnessed in that courtroom. Writing it all out helped me accept that the answer wasn't simple or clean. There was no version of this where everybody came out okay. A request came through the prison mail system from a documentary filmmaker who wanted to interview me about the case. The letter explained they were making a film about vigilante justice and wanted my perspective. I read it once and threw it away. Instead, I filled out a form to send a package through the approved channel Geraldine had set up. I ordered a blank sketchbook from the prison commissary and had it mailed to my niece at Kira and Darren's address. I included a short note saying I hoped she'd fill it with happy drawings of her new life. It felt like the right thing to do, A quiet way to show I cared about her future without pushing myself into her healing process. She needed space to recover, and I needed to respect that. Sitting in my cell as the second year of my sentence began, I thought about how I lost in court, but stopped the harm that was destroying her. The future stretched out unclear and long. I'd be almost 60 when I got out, assuming I made parole on the first try. But my niece was gaining weight and sleeping better and learning she was safe with people who knew how to protect her properly. It wasn't the ending I imagined when I pulled that trigger in the courtroom. I'd pictured something cleaner, more triumphant maybe. But she was alive and healing, and that had to be enough.